So in this video, we're going to be talking about nouns in a little bit more depth. We'll get into pronouns in later videos, but for this one, we're just going to talk about nouns. So there are two main types of nouns. We have proper nouns and common nouns. So proper nouns refer to specific nouns. They are capitalized. Okay. And they often name things. So I think good to be aware of like these specific sorts of features that are attached to nouns because they can help us identify them. Common nouns refer to general nouns, and they are always lowercase. So an example of a common noun, for instance, might be something like, let's say pool, right? We're just talking about any old pool. Whereas a proper noun, if we're talking about, let's see, where I grew up, it was called raging waters. But it was a water park, right? That's a name. There are two words, they're capitalized. So proper nouns can also be more than one word. Okay. Within these, there are count and non-count nouns. And I want to make sure that you have a good idea of what these are. So when we're talking about count versus non-count nouns, we're talking about nouns literally that can and cannot be easily counted. So count nouns means that they are literally countable. Right? Non-count nouns means cannot be counted. And I think this will make more sense in just a second. So let me give you an example. Um, Table. There was one table. There were two tables. There were three tables. Compare that, for instance, to flour. You wouldn't say there was one flour. We could say there was one bag of flour in the cabinet, but that's because bag is countable. You wouldn't say two flowers, unless you were talking about the lovely things with like petals. Baking flour, it's not countable, right? It's just a bunch of like little dust. And so for that reason, it's not countable. Now, interestingly, a word like sugar can be both a count and a non-count noun, because there are different meanings. So I, for instance, might say, give me two sugars in my coffee. However, I would not say I'm cooking with two sugars. I would say I'm cooking with sugar, because again, it's like a bunch of little tiny particles, and I am not counting every single little crumb of sugar. So the different meanings determine, in this case, whether or not it's count or it's a non-count noun. With countable nouns, they require determiners, especially when they're singular. With non-count nouns, determiners are unnecessary. Okay. So for instance, I might say, their table, right? But I don't have to say their flower. I could say flower is useful, right? All on its own. I wouldn't say table is useful all on its own. So it does become interesting as you start looking at some of those distinctions. So there are also specific types of determiners that tend to go with these different groups of words. So I'm going to go ahead and list those for you. So for countable nouns, we might use determiners like many, okay, a lot of, a few, or fewer, okay, um, a, another, one, two, three, etc., or some. Whereas with non-count nouns, we tend to use words like much, a lot of, less, and also some. So we would say there were many tables, whereas we wouldn't say there were many flour. We would say there was much flour. We might say there were fewer tables than we expected. We wouldn't say there were fewer flour than we expected. We would say there was less flour than we expected. So much and less and many and few are really good words for testing count versus non-count nouns. Okay. The next form that nouns can take that I want to talk about are collective nouns. So these are actually quite common nouns, but it means that they like refer to a group. So I will note that. So refer to a group, um, but are treated as singular, and that will make more sense in just a moment when I give you an example. So let's talk about an example. Um, I would say their family is on holiday. Okay. Um, family, there are multiple people in a family, right? And I'm gonna write that here. Multiple people. However, is a singular conjugation. Let me spell conjugation appropriately. Conjugation of the verb be. So what that means, right, is that we have a collective, which is family, but it's being treated as a singular. Interestingly, there is an exception. And that exception would be cattle. Um, so the cattle are on the move. Cattle is once again multiple, but are is a plural conjugation. And it is one of the very few collective nouns that has a plural conjugation. So when we're talking about collective nouns, what we're talking about is a group, but a group that is more often than not treated as a singular. The last type of noun that I want to talk to you about, the words are actually quite fun. Pluralia tantrums. I always want to say tantrums. Pluralia tantrums versus singular plurals. And I promise as soon as we start talking about these, you are going to know exactly the type of words that I am talking about. So pluralia tantrums refer to words that are inseparable in terms of kind of pairs, whereas singular plurals refer kind of like collective nouns to plurals treated like singulars. Okay. So I'm going to give you some examples and you will know, I think, instantly what I'm talking about. So let's start with singular plurals. Okay. Um, News, right? The news is interesting. We never talk about new. There's not like one new or two news. That's why it's a singular plural. It's only ever appears as a plural. And I will write that only appears as a plural. Um, Let's see. Um, so we would say the news is interesting. Um, an example of pluralia tantrums, pants, right? Um, Inseparable. We don't have a singular pant. All right, let's look at a few more, right? So another illustration associated with pants would be, say, scissors. Okay. Once again, we have like two things that are paired. And one way of thinking about it is like pairs um that only appear together. Okay. So pants, scissors are really good illustrations of that. In addition to news, it would be things like playing cards, right? You wouldn't say like I was playing card. You would say I'm playing cards. Something like measles, right? You never just have a measle. It's measles. So useful, I think, to be aware of these. They're quite fun. They're often treated the like similarly. You would say the news is, you wouldn't say the news are, right? So I'm just gonna say the news is interesting, right? You would treat it as a singular. You wouldn't say the news are interesting, right? So this one, not this one. Whereas we would not say the pants is tight, right? We would say the pants are tight, right? So in this case, they are treated as a plural, even though they only ever appear together almost as a singular. So these are kind of fun examples of nouns. So just be aware that even though we have proper and common nouns, there are different forms that nouns can take as well.